Think about this for a second. Right now, if you wanted to drive from New York City to Los Angeles, you could do it. You'd get on a highway, merge onto another highway, follow the green signs, cruise at 70 miles per hour through 5 time zones, and arrive on the West Coast barely inconvenienced. Along the way, you'd pass gas stations, rest stops, and fast food restaurants every few dozen miles. The road beneath you would be smooth, wide, and predictable. You'd never have to navigate a mud trail, bribe a farmer to pull your car out of a ditch, or wonder whether the bridge ahead could hold your weight. We use this system so casually, so automatically, that most of us have never once stopped to ask where it actually came from. But here's the thing. The Interstate Highway System, that 48,000-mile network of multi-lane, controlled access roads that stitches every major American city together, didn't exist until 1956. And before that year, driving across the United States wasn't a vacation. It was an ordeal. A muddy, tire-shredding, axle-breaking, potentially life-threatening ordeal that most Americans had absolutely no reason to attempt. A journey that today takes 4 days of highway driving once took months by wagon and years of political arguing just to make barely possible. So the question becomes, if there were no interstates for most of this country's history, how did Americans actually travel? What did long-distance movement look like before the highway existed? And what had to go so spectacularly wrong? What wars had to be fought and won? What communities had to be destroyed? What political deadlocks had to finally crack? For the federal government to step in and build the greatest road network in the history of the world. To answer that, we need to go back. Way back. To a time when the idea of a smooth, paved road was so exotic that most Americans had never seen one. Because the story of how America built its highway system is really a story about power. About which states got to control their roads, and which didn't. About the military's desperate need to move men and machines across a continent. And about a young Army officer who spent 62 miserable days crossing the country in 1919 and never forgot what he saw. Let's start at the very beginning. In the earliest days of the American Republic, travel wasn't a matter of highways or even roads in any meaningful sense. It was a negotiation with the landscape. A slow, exhausting, often dangerous negotiation that most ordinary people tried to avoid whenever possible. The roads that existed, if you could call them roads, were mostly dirt tracks, rutted by wagon wheels, flooded in spring, baked hard and cracked in summer, and turned into rivers of mud every time it rained. Bridges, when they existed at all, were often rickety wooden affairs that creaked ominously under heavy loads and washed away in floods with alarming regularity. For most ordinary Americans in the late 1700s and early 1800s, travel beyond your immediate neighborhood was something you did rarely and only when absolutely necessary. A farmer in rural Pennsylvania might travel to the nearest market town and back, a journey of perhaps 10 or 15 miles, and consider that a significant undertaking. The idea of traveling hundreds of miles crossing mountains and rivers and state lines was not part of ordinary life. It wasn't an aspiration. For most people, it wasn't even a fantasy. If you needed to move goods over long distances, you sent them by water. Rivers were the highways of early America. The Ohio River, the Hudson, the Mississippi, and their countless tributaries carried enormous amounts of freight at a fraction of the cost and effort of overland travel. Cities that sat along navigable rivers, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, grew into commercial powerhouses precisely because of this geographic advantage. Water moved things. Land didn't. But water couldn't go everywhere. And as America expanded westward, the question of how to move people and goods across the vast interior became increasingly urgent. The answer at first was simple: build better roads. The first major federal road project was called the National Road, and it was one of the most ambitious construction efforts in the young nation's history. The idea was straightforward: build a hard-surfaced road from the Atlantic seaboard westward into the interior, linking the settled east to the expanding frontier. Construction began in 1811 in Cumberland, Maryland, and the road pushed westward through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and eventually reached Vandalia, Illinois by 1837. The National Road used a technique called macadam paving, developed by Scottish engineer John Loudon Macadam. The road was built in layers of crushed stone, carefully graded and compacted, with a slightly curved surface designed to drain water to the sides. For its era, it was remarkable. It was the smoothest, most durable road that most Americans had ever traveled. Stagecoach lines ran along it. Freight wagons creaked along it in both directions, carrying goods east and settlers west. But the National Road also revealed something uncomfortable about how America actually felt about federal road building. It was expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain. Political battles over who should pay for upkeep, the federal government or the individual states through which it passed, dragged on for decades without resolution. President James Madison had actually vetoed an earlier internal improvements bill, arguing that the federal government had no constitutional authority to build roads and canals within state borders. The National Road was only possible because it crossed state lines and served a clear federal purpose. The moment you got into the weeds of who patches the potholes, everything fell apart. And then, just as the debate over federal road funding was heating up, the railroad arrived and made the whole conversation seem beside the point. In 1830, the first steam locomotive made its inaugural run in America along a stretch of track in South Carolina. Within 2 decades, railroads had spread across the eastern United States like a fast-growing vine. By 1860, there were more than 30,000 miles of railroad track in the country. By 1900, that number had grown to nearly 200,000 miles, more than in all of Europe combined. The railroad didn't just change how Americans traveled, it changed how America worked. It made the transcontinental movement of goods and people fast, reliable, and affordable, in ways that no road ever had or could. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts by rail, was one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. A journey that had taken months by wagon now took a week. The geography of the country didn't change, but its psychological size shrank dramatically. For the next half-century, the railroad was the undisputed ruler of American transportation. It shaped where cities grew, where industries located, and how farmers got their crops to market. If you wanted to travel any significant distance in America between 1870 and 1920, you got on a train. There was really no other option worth considering, and roads in this environment were largely irrelevant to anything beyond local movement. Advocates for better rural highways in the late 1800s were mostly farmers and cyclists, not long-distance travelers. The Good Roads movement, as it was called, pushed for better gravel roads between farms and market towns. That was the ceiling of its ambition. And then the automobile arrived and blew the ceiling off entirely. In 1893, Charles and Frank Duryea built the first gasoline-powered automobile in the United States in a Springfield, Massachusetts workshop. By 1900, there were about 8,000 cars in the entire country. By 1910, 458,000. By 1920, 8 million. By 1930, 23 million registered motor vehicles were on American roads. Think about that trajectory. In 30 years, the automobile went from a curiosity to a cornerstone of American life. Within a single generation, it became difficult to imagine how society had functioned without it. And it created a crisis that nobody had fully anticipated. Because the roads that existed in 1900 had been designed for horses and wagons. Most were unpaved. Many were maintained, if maintained at all, by local township governments that had neither the money nor the expertise to keep them in reasonable condition. Rain turned them to mud. Frost heaved gravel into ridges and ruts, and automobiles, with their pneumatic tires and relatively high speeds, destroyed these roads almost as fast as they were built. The situation was so bad that automobile travel in the early years required a kind of adventurism that bordered on the theatrical. Drivers carried shovels, chains, and extra tires as standard equipment. Getting stuck in the mud wasn't a possibility on a long trip. It was a certainty. Crossing a river meant finding a ferry, or a ford shallow enough to drive through, or a bridge sturdy enough to hold a car's weight, none of which were guaranteed. Navigation was a constant ordeal because road signs were either non-existent or so inconsistent from county to county that following them was almost worse than guessing. The first person to drive an automobile across the entire United States was a man named Horatio Nelson Jackson. In 1903, Jackson bet $50 that he could drive from San Francisco to New York in 90 days. He bought a used 20-horsepower Winton automobile, hired a mechanic named Sewall Crocker, and set off eastward. The trip took 63 days and was a remarkable ordeal even by the adventurous standards of the era. They got lost repeatedly. They got stuck in mud so deep they needed teams of horses to pull them out. They broke down constantly. In Wyoming, there were stretches with no road at all, just open-range land and compass headings. Jackson arrived in New York sunburned, exhausted, and triumphant. He'd proven it was possible. He'd also proven it was insane. But Americans loved their cars, and the more cars there were, the louder the demand for better roads became. Automobile clubs and associations became powerful lobbying forces, and a new idea began to take shape. What if private organizations built the roads instead of waiting for governments to act? The most famous example was the Lincoln Highway. Conceived in 1912 by entrepreneur Carl Fisher, the Lincoln Highway was an audacious project. A continuous, marked, publicly accessible route stretching 3,389 miles from Times Square in New York City to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. It would be the first coast-to-coast automobile route in the country. Fisher raised money from automobile manufacturers, tire companies, and cement producers who stood to profit from more driving. In 1913, the Lincoln Highway Association began marking and improving a route across the country, using existing local roads wherever possible. Maps were published. Guidebooks were printed. A new kind of American wanderlust took shape. The idea of the road trip was born right here, in this moment, around this route. But the Lincoln Highway was also a revealing lesson in the limits of private road building. The association could mark the route and lobby for improvements, but it couldn't compel state or local governments to actually pave their sections. The result was wildly uneven. Portions through New Jersey might be smooth concrete. Portions through Nevada were still desert tracks marked with red, white, and blue paint on fence posts. You could spend hours stuck in Iowa mud so deep your axles vanished. What the country clearly needed was a systematic, federally funded, nationally coordinated highway program. And in 1916, it got a partial version of one. The Federal Aid Road Act established a program of matching grants. The federal government would cover 50% of road construction costs if states matched the rest. It was a crucial step. But it focused on rural post roads and scattered local improvements, not on any kind of coherent national network. Then World War I created an entirely different lesson. When America entered the war in 1917 and began mobilizing an enormous army, the railroad system nearly buckled under the military's transportation demands. Freight piled up at depots. Troop movements were delayed. The War Department began to see roads and motor trucks not as civilian conveniences, but as military necessities. After the war, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921 took the program further, requiring that federal funds support a connected system of primary roads rather than scattered improvements. For the first time, someone in the federal government had used the word system in relation to American highways. Then in 1926, something happened that sounds mundane but was actually revolutionary. Working with the Federal Bureau of Public Roads, highway officials established a numbered national highway system. Roads would be numbered rather than named. East-west routes would carry even numbers. North-south routes would carry odd numbers. The familiar numbered highway shield that still appears on signs across the country today was introduced as a standardized national language of navigation. The most famous of these numbered highways was U.S. Route 66, running 2,400 miles from Chicago to Santa Monica through 8 states. Route 66 became embedded in American culture in a way no road before it ever had. It was the main street of America. The road Dust Bowl migrants followed west when Oklahoma and Texas turned to dust. The highway John Steinbeck immortalized in The Grapes of Wrath, the symbol of freedom and movement that would inspire artists, writers, musicians, and dreamers for decades. But Route 66 was also a revealing portrait of the limitations of the numbered highway system. Yes, you could drive from Chicago to Los Angeles, but you did it through the centers of dozens of small towns, stopping at traffic lights, navigating intersections, sharing the road with pedestrians and tractors. The road changed surface constantly. Concrete in one county, asphalt in the next, gravel after that, and occasionally nothing distinguishable from a cow path. It was often just 2 lanes wide. This was a network of local and regional roads stitched together end to end. It was not a highway system in any modern sense, and the gap between what America had and what it actually needed was about to be exposed in the most uncomfortable possible way. In the summer of 1919, the United States Army organized the first transcontinental motor convoy. The idea was to test whether the military could move a large convoy of vehicles from coast to coast using the roads that existed. If war came to American shores, could the Army move troops and supplies quickly across the continent? The convoy left the White House on July 7th with 81 vehicles, trucks, ambulances, motorcycles, and support vehicles, along with 260 officers and men. Their destination was San Francisco. They traveled along the Lincoln Highway. What followed was 62 days of grinding misery. The convoy averaged 58 miles per day. They got stuck in mud repeatedly. 88 bridges collapsed under the weight of military vehicles. Trucks sank to their axles in Nevada quicksand. Men suffered heat exhaustion in the desert. Mechanical breakdowns consumed days of time. One of the observers riding with that convoy was a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight Eisenhower. He was 28 years old. He watched the entire ordeal with a mixture of professional fascination and personal frustration. He filed a report noting the poor roads, the inadequate bridges, and the constant delays. He concluded that the United States desperately needed better infrastructure for military purposes. Then he filed the report and went on with his career. But he did not forget. 25 years later, General Eisenhower commanded the Allied forces in Europe. As he drove through Germany in 1945 at the head of the victorious Allied armies, he saw something that stopped him cold. The German Autobahn. Hitler had ordered the construction of the Autobahn network in 1933, and by the end of the war, Germany had built nearly 2,400 miles of four-lane, limited-access, high-speed highway. Eisenhower watched American military vehicles move across Germany at speeds and efficiencies that would have been impossible on American roads. Logistics that would have taken days on Route 66 took hours on the Autobahn. The military advantage was obvious, enormous, and deeply memorable to a man who had once spent 62 days crawling across his own country at 58 miles per day. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the inadequacy of American roads had become a national embarrassment and a genuine crisis. The post-war economic boom had sent car ownership into the stratosphere. In 1945, there were 25 million registered vehicles in America. By 1955, there were 52 million. The roads that had barely served the country in the 1930s were now dangerously overwhelmed. Traffic jams in cities stretched for miles. Two-lane rural highways were choked with trucks and commuters. Accidents were epidemic. In 1955 alone, more than 38,000 Americans died in traffic accidents. Every single year. That is more than 100 people a day, dying on roads that were simply not designed for the volume or speed of traffic they were being asked to carry. Planners and politicians had been talking about a national expressway system for 2 decades. The Interregional Highways Report of 1944 had called for a 40,000-mile national network. Various bills had been introduced in Congress, but the debate over how to pay for it had stalled every proposal. States didn't want to surrender control. The trucking industry and oil companies fought over whether to fund construction with tolls or fuel taxes. Rural lawmakers worried that an urban-focused highway system would bypass their constituents entirely. It was a perfect policy deadlock. Everyone agreed the country needed better highways. Nobody could agree on how to build or pay for them. And then, in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower became President of the United States. The man who had slogged across the country on the 1919 convoy. The man who had watched American trucks fly across the German Autobahn. The man who had never forgotten either experience. He was now in a position to do something about it, and he was determined. Eisenhower framed the highway project not as a convenience, but as a military and civil defense necessity. In the nuclear age, he argued, American cities were potential targets for Soviet attack. The country needed roads wide and strong enough to evacuate millions of civilians quickly, and to move military equipment to any point on the continent within hours rather than days. After years of political negotiation and compromise, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Eisenhower signed it into law on June 29, 1956. The law was extraordinary in its scale. It authorized construction of 41,000 miles of highway connecting the nation's major cities. It established a highway trust fund financed by federal gasoline taxes, tire taxes, and a use tax on heavy trucks. The federal government would pay 90% of construction costs. states would contribute just 10%. The system would be built to uniform national standards. At least 4 lanes, completely grade separated, controlled access through ramps only. No intersections at road level. No traffic lights, no cross traffic. Speed and safety built in through design, not signage. This was the Interstate Highway System, and building it was the largest public works project in human history up to that point. The construction numbers are difficult to fully absorb. At peak activity in the 1960s, workers were completing roughly 3,000 miles of new highway per year. More than 42,000 bridges were built or upgraded. More than 50 tunnels were bored through mountains. Workers moved more earth than had been excavated for the Panama Canal. They poured more concrete than in any previous human undertaking. Entire sections of cities were demolished to make room for elevated interchanges and urban expressways that planners promised would eliminate congestion and bring prosperity. And the transformation of American life was immediate and profound. The most visible change was in freight. Before the interstate, moving goods long distances by truck was slow, expensive, and deeply unreliable. Roads were too narrow, too varied, and too congested to support efficient commercial trucking at any real scale. After the interstate, a truck could load in Los Angeles and deliver in New York in 3 days. Reliably, predictably, at highway speed the entire way. The modern supply chain, the one that puts California lettuce in New York supermarkets and Amazon packages on your doorstep in 2 days, is built on top of that 1956 decision. Without the interstate, it doesn't exist. The second transformation was in where Americans chose to live. Before the interstate, suburban development clustered around rail lines and local road networks. You could live outside the city, but you needed to be near a train station to function. The interstate changed the equation entirely. Now it didn't matter if you lived 30 miles from downtown. If you had a car and an on-ramp nearby, you could be at your desk in 40 minutes. The commutable radius of every major American city expanded enormously, overnight. This triggered a suburban explosion that dwarfed even the post-war housing boom. Subdivisions pushed further and further from city centers. Shopping malls, which required vast parking lots that only made sense with car-dependent customers, appeared along interstate interchanges across the country. Drive-through restaurants, motel chains, big-box retailers, distribution centers, the entire commercial ecosystem that defines most American landscapes today. None of it exists without the interstate. The suburban life that still dominates our collective image of middle-class America, the yard, the driveway, the commute, was made physically possible in 1956. American culture changed alongside it. The road trip became a defining national experience. Loading up the family station wagon and driving cross-country, stopping at Howard Johnson's for lunch, sleeping in a Holiday Inn, filling up at a Flying J, was made possible because the highway was smooth, predictable, and continuous from coast to coast. Tourism surged. National parks that had once been essentially inaccessible to working families suddenly had millions of visitors a year. An entirely new geography of American leisure appeared, built on the assumption that anyone with a car and a week off could go anywhere. But there is a darker chapter here, one that played out in cities across America and whose consequences are still visible and still debated today. When planners routed the interstates through urban areas, they faced a basic problem. The most direct routes required demolishing existing neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods chosen for demolition were, with devastating consistency, the ones with the least political power to fight back. They were, overwhelmingly, black neighborhoods and low-income communities. In city after city, the pattern was identical. In Nashville, Interstate 40 was routed directly through the historically black Jefferson Street corridor, demolishing businesses, churches, and homes that had been the center of black commercial and cultural life for generations. In Miami, a thriving black business district called Overtown, once known as the Harlem of the South, a place where Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday performed when they were barred from white hotels, was split apart by Interstate 95. Thousands of residents were displaced. The community never recovered its former vitality. In New Orleans, the Claiborne Avenue corridor, a vibrant commercial and cultural strip lined with ancient live oak trees in the median, the heart of black social life in the city, was buried under an elevated section of Interstate 10. The oaks were cut down, the businesses closed. A corridor that had sustained itself for generations was severed and silenced. In Syracuse, in Baltimore, in Birmingham, in Detroit, the story repeated itself with grim regularity. The highways went where the people with the least power to resist them lived. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that the construction of the Interstate Highway System displaced somewhere between 475,000 and 1 million families across the country. The vast majority were low income, disproportionately non-white. They were removed from communities that had taken generations to build, communities with their own economies, their own social networks, their own institutions. They were relocated to wherever space and money happened to allow, which was rarely anywhere as good. And there was a second, quieter harm, one that happened not where the highways were built, but where they weren't. Small towns across America that had thrived as stops along Route 66 or other pre-interstate highways found themselves stranded when the new roads were routed around them. Without the through traffic, gas stations closed, motels shuttered, and diners that had fed generations of travelers went dark almost overnight. Towns like Shamrock, Texas, and Tucumcari, New Mexico, and hundreds of others along old Route 66 lost their economic reason for existing the moment a freeway bypassed them by 5 miles. They became ghost towns while the highway hummed in the distance. These aren't merely historical grievances. They are living realities. The communities destroyed to build urban interstates never fully rebuilt themselves. The racial and economic geography of American cities today, the concentrated poverty in certain neighborhoods, the isolation of communities from economic opportunity, the physical barriers between rich and poor districts, can be traced in significant part to the highway routing decisions made by planners in the 1950s and 1960s. Infrastructure decisions made 70 years ago are still shaping where people live and how they fare today. Now let's step back and consider what all of this means in the broader sweep of history. The Interstate Highway System is one of the most audacious acts of public investment in the history of any government anywhere on Earth. It connected a continent. It made the movement of people and goods across 3,000 miles of diverse, challenging landscape into something routine, something that Americans do every day without a second thought. It created the physical infrastructure on which the modern American economy operates. It reshaped where 330 million people live, where they work, how they shop, and how they think about distance and possibility. Before 1956, a cross-country drive was a minor expedition. You needed maps, patience, mechanical knowledge, and a high tolerance for uncertainty. After 1956, it became a logistics problem. That shift, in what was possible, in what was expected, in how Americans understood the geography of their own country, is so fundamental that it's almost impossible to fully appreciate from inside it. It is worth noting that this system is, like so much of American economic life, distinctly and almost uniquely American. Most other developed nations have not built anything remotely comparable in scale or uniformity. Europe's highway networks are extensive but fragmented by national borders and political traditions that predate the automobile. China has built an impressive expressway system in recent decades, but it came much later and through a very different political and economic process. The combination of scale, standardization, federal coordination, and sheer ambition of what the United States built between 1956 and the 1990s remains without true parallel, but the system we built has its own costs that have taken decades to fully reckon with. The American economy's profound dependence on trucking and the automobile means that every disruption, every gasoline price spike, every supply chain shock, every major storm that closes an interstate ripples through the entire system with extraordinary speed. The environmental consequences of a civilization built around the car are enormous and still accumulating. Carbon emissions, sprawl-consuming farmland and forest, stormwater runoff from millions of acres of impermeable asphalt, and the infrastructure itself is aging. Many of the original interstate bridges and roadways built in the late 1950s and 1960s were designed for a 50-year lifespan. That lifespan has passed. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the nation's infrastructure a D+ grade. The backlog of deferred highway and bridge maintenance runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The system that was built as a permanent solution to the transportation problem of the 20th century is now itself the problem. a maintenance obligation that stretches forward indefinitely with no clear plan to meet it. And yet, when you get on a highway tomorrow morning and merge into traffic at 70 miles per hour, it will feel entirely natural, entirely inevitable. You will not think about Horatio Nelson Jackson, stuck to his axles in Wyoming mud in 1903, wishing there was a road. You will not think about Eisenhower standing on the German Autobahn in 1945, staring at something he had never seen and making a mental note he would carry for a decade. You will not think about the neighborhoods in Nashville and Miami and New Orleans that were demolished to make way for the concrete above you, or the small towns that were bypassed and slowly died. But all of that happened. All of it is woven into the road beneath your wheels. The Interstate Highway System is not a natural feature of the American landscape. It is one of the most deliberate, most political, most consequential, and most deeply flawed acts of public investment in the history of the United States. It was built with government money, driven by military fears, shaped by Cold War anxiety, routed by decisions that reflected the racial and economic hierarchies of mid-20th century America, and made possible only by decades of painful trial and error, with dirt roads and wagon tracks and numbered highways that tried their best and weren't enough. Before 1956, traveling from one end of this country to the other meant consulting paper maps, praying for dry weather, hoping bridges held, and accepting that the journey itself would test you. After 1956, it meant turning the key and pointing yourself at the on-ramp. That transformation was not accidental. It was not the inevitable result of market forces or private enterprise, or the natural evolution of technology. It had to be decided, funded, designed, fought for politically, built at enormous cost, and paid for by a government that concluded the alternative, the crumbling, inadequate, dangerous status quo, was simply no longer acceptable. Understanding where the highway came from helps us understand what it actually is. Not a background condition, not a given, but a choice. A choice that was made once, deliberately and imperfectly, with enormous consequences that we are still living with today. And a choice that could, in theory, be made differently, if we can find the same clarity of purpose and willingness to invest that made it possible the first time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does make a difference, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. And if you haven't already, make sure you check out this video right here. I think you'll love it.